Okay, I think we're ready to go. So, good evening, everybody, and good evening in particular to Dr. Amanda Sloat, who's joining us from, I don't know, I was going to say sunny Madrid, but I don't know if I'm being accurate there.
It's
And
sunny
welcome
today.
to this sunny today. Well, there we go. And welcome to this event organised by the European Movement in Scotland. For those of you who don't know the European Movement, its basic goal is membership of the European Union, which was a much easier case to make before 2016 than it is now. But the view being that in turbulent times, being involved with Europe and keeping the flame burning in terms of aligning Scotland with Europe and hopefully as many other places as well is the place to be. And that seems a good background from which to start this conversation with Dr. Amanda Sloat. Now, Amanda will talk a bit about herself, um, uh, but she is the professor of practice at the IE University in Madrid, which I think is Instituto de Empresa originally, is it?
Correct. Business school.
That's right. There you go. And was a former special assistant to the president and senior director for Europe at the National Security Council. But also, among many other things, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, just up the road from me here today. So perhaps before we sort of kick off on what is a pretty rich topic right now in terms of the transatlantic relationship, it might be useful for everybody to hear a little bit of your journey, Amanda, how you ended up in Madrid and the road you've taken, which includes Scotland, Holyrood, Brussels, Belfast, and everything else.
I will. Well, first of all, I thank you to you, John. It's great to see you and it's great to participate in this event with the European movement, who had been one of the early friends and supporters of mine when I first arrived in Scotland. So to make what could be a very long story short, I tell people that I'm the poster child for study abroad changing my life. I grew up in Michigan. I studied political theory and told my friends who were studying international relations that I had no real interest in what was happening in the rest of the world. And to age myself, I came on a study abroad program to the UK in the summer of 1996. We spent a month in London and then we spent a week in Edinburgh. And I fell in love with Edinburgh. Let me pause here. I'm seeing lots of messages. It sounds like there's some sort of echo coming through. So I don't know for the organizers if there's anything that we need to do. I know John is now muted, so hopefully that's better. So fell in love really with Edinburgh, and if all of you can remember back to the summer of 1996, it was gearing up for the election campaign that Tony Blair ended up winning in 1997. Lots of talks about Scottish devolution, and having studied the American founding as an undergrad, I was very excited about the idea of being in a place that was setting up its own new government. So I envisioned myself coming to Scotland and experiencing essentially the American founding in person. So ended up moving to Edinburgh in the fall of 1997 and spent 3 really wonderful years in Edinburgh studying the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, and in particular looking at what was then known as multi-level governance, its relationship with the British government and with the European Union. I did a stage in the European Commission. I did a postdoc in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And then eventually ended up going back to the US after 7 years in Europe and a lot of significant changes in Washington following 9/11, the war in Iraq. I felt like it was time to go back and engage with my own country and my own government. So I put into practice everything that I had learned during my time in Europe. I served as the European Policy Advisor to the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. During the Obama administration, I served in the State Department, principally as the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for U.S. relations towards Southern Europe, which was Turkey, Greece during the financial crisis, Cyprus, and then also Eastern Mediterranean affairs, which meant that I was working a lot with our Middle East colleagues on the whole raft of issues that the US and Europe were cooperating at the time, including the aftermath of the war in Libya, the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the refugee crisis coming through Turkey into Greece and the rest of Europe. I spent the first Trump administration at the Brookings Institution, where I found a somewhat unusual niche explaining Brexit and particularly the implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland to an American audience who did not really understand Brexit. And even more strangely, ended up appearing on the BBC quite regularly, with people telling me that a Midwestern accent somehow made Brexit clearer to them. And then during the Biden administration, I went into the White House and had the real honor of serving as President Biden's Europe advisor for the first 3 years of his administration, where I was responsible for supporting him in all of the calls, meetings, visits that he did to Europe, and also coordinating Europe policy across the US government. So during my time, I had three British prime ministers, two British monarchs, and then, of course, a war in Ukraine that ended up taking up a significant amount of time. And then, just to wrap up this story of my life, after 3 years, I decided to take a bit of time off and traveled for a year. I essentially took my gap year about 20 years late. And then ended up in Madrid almost exactly a year ago. I was very keen to come back to Europe. I was interested in seeing what Europe looked like from the south after all of my time living in Europe's north. And since serving in government was no longer an option for me, the best thing that I felt like I could do with my time was prepare the next generation of leaders and hopefully encourage young people to continue considering careers in public service.
Right, I'm going to keep myself muted in the meantime, just to make sure that there's no echo if everybody else can do the same. Yeah, I mean, just to touch on what you said at the end there, that you said it was no longer possible for you to be in government. That's just to remind everybody that's because of the political nature of the administrations in a way that's slightly different from our UK model.
Yeah, that's right. So my time serving in the administration were serving as a political appointee. So I went in as a political appointee during the Obama administration, and then I went in as a political appointee during the Biden administration. We still, of course, have a very large number of career civil servants and career diplomats who are serving in government and are nonpartisan officials who serve both administrations. So yeah, you're right. For me, it was very much determined by the political appointment system that we have.
Yeah, right. Now, I should have said at the outset that what we'll do is we've got a few questions between us, and then we'll, please use the Q&A capacity in Zoom. If you go to more, if you can't see it, the Q&A should be there, and we'll gather them and come on to them later on. But I mean, it could not be more timely, this subject, given everything that's going on literally today. But you also were published in the Washington Post today. And just to quote your opening line, as an American living in Europe, I am frequently asked if my compatriots understand the extent of the damage being done to all facets of transatlantic relations by the Trump administration's bullying policies. My answer, sadly, is no, which seems like a perfect place for us to start. I mean, just if it's at all possible to separate the literally minute by minute changes that are going on, where do you think we stand at the moment? Is Iran just another brick out of the wall between us, or is it, is there any real change in where we've been for the last year and 2 months?
I don't think there's necessarily any particular change. I think things just continue to get worse. And in a way, I think Europeans become increasingly numb to the threats that Trump is making. Yeah, thank you for referencing the piece. I've done a number of events like this. I did one with the German audience, for example, after the national security strategy was published, in which the document describes civilizational decline in Europe, criticizes Europe's approach to human rights to freedom of speech issue, talks about the Trump administration wanting to support far right parties in Europe, and was asked by the Germans if Americans realized how painful this was for them. And it's a question that I've been asked on numerous other occasions. And I have really tried in my role as an American in Spain to try and explain to European audiences what is happening in the United States. To plug another piece of mine, I wrote a piece in Time Magazine on January 2nd, where I really made the case for Europeans to continue forging their own path. I told them that hope was not a strategy and they needed to stop the wishful thinking that the United States was going to come back soon. And then I published a piece in Foreign Policy last October trying to detail a lot of the very difficult things that were happening in the United States, things that really aren't even necessarily being captured in the media or are somewhat under the radar given how much stuff is in the media all of the time. Uh, all of the audience will know better than I can explain how Europeans are feeling about the United States. But what has been particularly evident to me is I feel like this moment is qualitatively different from disagreements that we've had in the past. As I laid out in my timeline, I was living in Britain and other parts of Europe during the Bush administration, and remember talking to a lot of European friends about opposition that they had to the war in Iraq. There was a lot of focus at that time on American black sites, on debates around torture. We had the era of old Europe and new Europe and freedom fries, and it was not a great moment in transatlantic relations. But I really feel like what is happening now is qualitatively different. This isn't simply a disagreement about a government policy issue. This is something that is being felt very viscerally by European citizens and is leading large numbers of European citizens not to travel to the US. That students are not wanting to study in the United States. Friends of mine who have children of university age are discouraging them from applying to the United States. We have citizens in Nordic countries who are using apps that enable them to scan barcodes and identify the origins of a product and identify national alternatives. And I really fear that uh, the United States used to be seen as a source of hope and inspiration for so many Europeans, going back into the Cold War, back into the Big Mac days. I hear Spaniards tell me that they learned English by watching American movies and listening to American music. And I really fear that a lot of that hope and admiration that Europeans had in the past is now turning to a sense of fear in many cases and disdain in other cases. And to your question, I think there have been a number of slights and policy disagreements that we've seen over the last year that have contributed to that. We had the Trump administration almost start a trade war with Europe over the imposition of very strong tariffs and ultimately negotiating a pretty imbalanced trade deal with the EU, the one with the UK, not too much better. We've heard the president threaten repeatedly and as recently as last week to leave NATO after hectoring the Europeans to spend more on their defense. We've seen European leaders sidelined in discussions with Ukraine. We've seen a lot of frustration that Americans have with Europeans about the handling of the war in Iran. But for me, the real turning point came at the beginning of the year when Trump indicated that he might use military force to take Greenland. And I think for many Americans, they don't understand how tangibly this was felt in Europe and frankly, how traumatic it was for many Europeans to actually have to contemplate the idea of military conflict with historically their strongest and closest ally. And so I really do worry about the damage that is being done to the relationship.
In terms of Project 2025 and all the things that we were talking about before the election itself, was all this coming, or is this has it been accentuated by a sense of we need to stop spending money on other people, or actually we've got a better bully pulpit than we thought we did, and therefore we can push our opportunities here? Is it a happy coincidence, if that's the correct word, that we've come to this point, or was this really always the flight path? Do you think from last January?
I mean, I think there's a number of things at play here. I mean, first, you mentioned Project 2025, and the administration seems to be pretty systematically working through the policy proposals that were included there. And so, nothing in a sense that the administration is doing should be a surprise. They have put it in writing, they have said it, and they are continuing to follow through with it. Second, Trump has learned the lessons effectively from his first administration, and he has put in place people that are prepared to enable his decisions. Trump did not expect to win the first time. He did not have a clear set of policies. He did not have his own set of personnel in place. And so ended up with a lot of moderate traditional Republicans in these offices who effectively provided a sense of guardrails on some of the things that he was wanting to do. Jim Mattis as defense secretary is one example. Mike Pence, who ultimately did the right thing on January 6th by certifying the election in 2020, is another. And so Trump learned that if you really effectively want to make change, you need to have a loyal cadre of people working for you. And so that is one of the big differences that we're seeing with this administration from the last one. The third thing that I will say, especially on some of the military activity that we have seen, is I think Trump gained a strong sense of confidence based on the success of past military efforts. The US and Israel did very targeted precision strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities last summer that were very clean, were very effective, and apparently had fairly devastating results. The operation to remove Maduro from Venezuela was also very short, very successful, no American casualties, a very clean in and out. And so it seems from a lot of the reporting that's happened that Trump seemed to believe that Iran was going to go similarly. There's also been a real decimation of the internal interagency policy process that I used to manage on Europe, where we don't have ambassadors in a lot of these countries in the Middle East. There was clearly not sufficient contingency planning that was happening. There was not people that could have foreseen what were fairly obvious consequences of this war in Iran to flag those and then actually plan in preparation. And then finally, for Europe, we have seen an end to something that was always a principle of the Biden administration, which was to ensure our allies were not surprised and to ensure that they were consulted and involved in these decisions. And the fact that you had the Italian defense minister, of all people, on holiday in the Gulf when the war in Iran started is just emblematic of the fact that this consultation was not happening with our closest allies.
And I mean, where anybody who's worked in the European Union in some form or another is conscious that although there's a lot of solidarity within the institutions, you always have to remember that there are 27, 28 at one point member state governments all moving at different speeds, all with different politics. And it doesn't seem to be that that's something that the United States administration at least currently understands. I mean, if we go back as far as Kennedy and Dulles and all the people who supported the original motion, there was a sense that people got the Monet method, if you like. But it seems that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that almost that there's been a surprise on the other side of the Atlantic at the extent to which there isn't a simple push button unity in Europe, and that people will take views depending on their own national interest rather than what Vice President Vance seems to be saying in Budapest today, that it's all been run by EU diplomats and bureaucrats. Do you think there is a lack of understanding of the depth of European policy making, or is it simply just ideology?
I mean, I am quite confident in saying that there probably is not depth of knowledge in Washington about the way the European Union works. I mean, this is something that's been historically true for decades, going back to Kissinger's question of who you call in Europe. I have to say, for the Biden administration, von der Leyen became the answer to that question. And Biden and von der Leyen had a very close and effective working relationship and were able to get a lot of things done quite quickly. To me, it's always been somewhat amazing that the European Union works at all. I mean, all you have to do is travel around Europe and see how different culturally, politically, linguistically all of the countries are. And certainly the United States would find it very difficult to come to agreement with the 27 countries. And obviously the administrations are going to have bilateral relationships with countries. I mean, even the Biden administration, we would talk to the Quad quite a bit, to the UK, France, and Germany, sometimes Italy with the Quint. They were the countries that were the strongest militarily. They were parts of the G7, and so there was always going to be bilateral conversation. But I think really during the Biden administration, we tried to work closely with the European Union and then with the UK as part of that, as closely as possible, especially when it came to sanctions, for example, that we were imposing on Russia for the Ukraine war, sanctions that we imposed on Belarus. There was a recognition that our sanctions were going to be much more effective if we were able to do them in cooperation with Europe. The big difference with the Trump administration is, leaving aside the question of whether they even understand how it works, Trump has described the European Union as a foe. And has talked about how the European Union was set up to screw the United States, which is just such a fundamental misreading of history, that you long had the support of the United States behind the European Union to rise Europe up from the ashes of war, to integrate countries from Central and Eastern Europe that had been living under communism. And I think for Trump, and I really feel this is a lesson that Europeans should internalize more. Trump has recognized that he is much more powerful dealing with, in some cases, bullying individual members of the European Union. It is much harder for him to do that when it comes collectively to the power of the EU 27. And so for me, I would actually like to see the EU continue to find ways to operate with greater unity, to speak more effectively with a single voice on a number of these issues, and not necessarily give the administration the opportunity to pick off individual countries.
Do you think there's an extent to, if you remember back to Trump 1 and his, as usual, claiming his own soothsaying facilities, that he said that he knew Brexit was coming and he anticipated all of this. Do you think there's been a sense to which a bit like some politicians here in the United Kingdom, thought that that was a sign of things to come, and rather than an exception to the rule, and that somehow if Britain could be peeled off, that other member states could be either fractured or peeled off in the same way?
It's always very dangerous to speculate on what Trump may have thought or assumed. I'm not clear. I'm not even sure he necessarily thought you needed to go through the bureaucracy of having countries leave the EU the way that the UK did. You mentioned Vance's visit to Hungary this week, which is just an extraordinary example of interference in a country's domestic politics, to send your vice president to put the president on the phone at effectively a campaign rally just days before the election. And so I think for the Trump administration, they want to continue to engage with countries on an individual basis.
That takes us to the big question, really, which has been around a lot, which is NATO, and whether it can. There are endless speculation of whether he actually wants to come out of it. What would happen if he did? Um, is Europe ready to face that? And I don't know whether you have a new perspective on this from your position in Spain, which has been quite a clear advocate of where it thinks Europe should be going. There's a question mark over whether the UK could be formally part of a European safe method rather than NATO. But I mean, can we rely on the European public to support heavy defense expenditure, not just on Ukraine, but maybe on the high north as well? And if there is this movement, whether it's pushed by an exit from NATO or a continued negativity towards NATO, how would the US actually respond to that if there was a parallel military structure that actually seemed to be in some ways doing the job or filling the gap?
That's an excellent set of questions and trying to remember them all and to unpack this. So let me say a couple of things. I mean, first, Trump is not the first US president to call on Europeans to spend more on their defense. I mean, this actually goes back to Eisenhower, and even Obama referred to Europeans as free riders. And so with Trump, without Trump, it is simply not sustainable for American taxpayers to continue funding the bulk of Europe's defense. Uh, that's simply something that has to change. And I think there is bipartisan appreciation for the fact that countries have now committed to spending 5% on defense, although that 5% needs to be spent wisely, not just on pensions and salaries for members of the military, importantly as that is, and not simply on building up national stocks, but really on finding ways to integrate, to coordinate, to harmonize standards. For example, when I was in the White House and we were trying to find military equipment for Ukraine, it became very apparent that European countries actually have different standards for their 155 ammunition that was being used for weapons in Ukraine because there are rules around national certification of the different types of ammunition. I was recently on a panel in Warsaw where a Polish general was talking about the fact that there's actually different standards for medical kits. And so a British soldier could not use a German medical kit because those medical kits need to be standardized by national governments. That's the kind of thing that has to change. So first, broad bipartisan support for Europe to spend more on defense. Second, it gets to the question of whether or not the publics would actually support this as you raised it. And I think Europe has had a fairly good deal, frankly, out of this over the last number of decades because the money that Europe has not spent on defense, they have been able to invest in things like national health care, infrastructure, and other public services. And so, not surprisingly, the general public has gotten used to having these social welfare benefits and is not necessarily going to respond positively to cuts in those services to fund defense. And frankly, I think European leaders should be making national cases for why national defense is in their interest, that it's not simply something that they are being bullied into by the Trump administration. Third, how our future US administration is going to respond to this. I feel there is a certain acknowledgement that needs to be made on the European side or on the American side that we have not always necessarily been as supportive of European efforts to develop autonomous defense capabilities as we should. There has long been a belief that NATO should be the premier transatlantic security alliance. It always has been. There was a little bit of discomfort with the European Union wanting to develop its own defense identity. There was a little bit of discomfort with Europeans wanting to create a European pillar within inside NATO. And there was a strong desire to keep this transatlantic. We've actually seen this playing out now in the last couple of weeks with a growing number of European countries that are refusing to allow US access to their bases or to their airspace for offensive operations in Iran. And this has been a little bit surprising to Trump, even though perhaps it shouldn't been. Historically, there has been this implicit bargain that the United States provides your security guarantees, and in return, you give us essentially unfettered access to your bases and your airspace. But it's not a surprise that when Trump starts talking about pulling out of NATO, denigrating NATO allies, and then doesn't consult or build any sort of meaningful coalition with European allies, that they are not going to be so keen to get involved in a war that they weren't consulted on and in many cases end up seeing as illegal. So in terms of where this leaves us, for me, the best case scenario is that European countries do invest in a very serious way in their own defense capabilities, and they do it in terms of very real and meaningful reforms. They make sure that everything is brought up to standard, and they try and find a way to harmonize these capabilities and this equipment amongst themselves. In the best case scenario, if we end up having a Democratic administration or even a more mainstream Republican administration coming into the White House in the future, Europe is a much more capable and effective security partner that we can work with on shared global challenges, or that Europe is much more capable of dealing with security issues in its own neighborhood, freeing up the United States to focus potentially on China and elsewhere. As for this question of whether or not Trump is going to leave NATO, he certainly continues to threaten it. There is not bipartisan support for this in the United States. There is deep recognition on both sides of the aisle of the importance of NATO. And interestingly, in the first Trump administration, Congress actually passed legislation saying that the United States needed to have two-thirds congressional approval in order to withdraw from NATO, essentially trying to prevent Trump or a future like-minded president from pulling the US out of NATO. And interestingly, it was Marco Rubio that co-sponsored this piece of legislation. Now, the practical reality is that even short of leaving NATO, the fact that we are having this conversation really undermines a lot of the deterrent value of NATO. And there's other things that Trump could do in terms of not fully responding to security threats facing NATO allies, even while still inside the alliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And we might come back to the future looking forward, but I've been looking at the questions as they come in, and there's a couple that talk about the edges. I mean, we haven't really talked specifically about the UK's role in all of this because, it is playing a very difficult balancing game, and I don't fancy Keir Starmer's job in that. But if we look over to the eastern flank, which obviously has until relatively recently has occupied everybody's mind until Greenland became an issue. There's one question about the eastern flank nations from Finland to Poland down to Romania, um, taking on the traditional role that Western Europe had in hosting US permanent military installations. Is the agreement that I think it's the NRFA is quoted? Is that still in place? Is that something that will still be treated as valid? Is there a likely, because we've seen such a change just with Ukraine, with Finland and Sweden coming in, even Ireland starting to have discussions about neutrality, Iceland starting to rethink its place. Is there potential for a really quite substantial shift in military and security apparatus within Europe?
I mean, I think the NATO-Russia Founding Act is essentially dead. I think Russia has violated that with a lot of the actions that it's taken in Ukraine and elsewhere, and so I think the principles governing that are largely obsolete at this point. It is interesting that we are seeing a bit of a difference between Eastern and Western Europe, and in a way, it's reminiscent of what I referred to earlier, which was the old Europe and the new Europe debates that we had of the Bush administration, because you are seeing Eastern European countries. I am hearing this from diplomats, even frankly students that I am talking to, that countries that are on the eastern flank feeling much greater sense of vulnerability, not surprisingly, to the potential of Russian aggression. And so they are very afraid of saying no to Trump because they worry that Trump could then end up pulling US troops out of their countries, which they depend on as a sense of security guarantee. Sitting here in Spain, people don't feel particularly threatened by much of anything, right? I mean, there's no risk coming from France in the north. Many years ago, there was a little bit of conflict with Morocco. There's sometimes some debates about migrants coming through. But there's not really a sense of physical insecurity here in Spain. And I think, in the UK, you're that much further out to also have a much more capable standalone military. And so I think there is a difference in how we are seeing some of these Eastern European countries respond. I think historically, there is still a very strong sense of affection and appreciation to the United States for everything that they did for them during the Cold War. And there is this continued sense of dependence on the United States for their security in a way that you don't see Macron, for example, talking about his own nuclear weapons and the possible of expanding the nuclear umbrella that is felt in the same way. And so for me, part of what is driving that difference between East and West is the extent to which countries currently feel vulnerable, particularly from Russian aggression, and feel like they need to stay on the good side of the United States, lest Trump decide that he is going to withdraw troops from their countries.
Right. Yeah, I might come back to the nuclear deterrent in a minute, but while we're over on the east, there's been a lot of talk about the risk of escalation in Ukraine. I mean, and it seems crazy that we haven't been talking about Ukraine for a month for other reasons, but the idea of it bleeding over and potentially Russia having its eye on the Baltic states or beyond. I mean, one, how do you assess that? Do you think that's a genuine threat? Certainly, the Estonian president, former president who came and spoke for us, certainly made it clear that he considered it a threat. And if so, what implications does that have for Article 5, which, as we've seen recently, is not something that is either necessarily, how should I put this, supported or understood in certain parts of the White House at the moment in terms of no one's ever come to our aid under Article 5. So is the risk real, do we think, in terms of Russia moving beyond Ukraine? And if so, do we think Article 5 will hold up to that?
When I used to work in government, we would refuse to engage on hypothetical questions that may not happen, but I will do my best to take a stab. I mean, if I was sitting in the Baltic countries, I would probably be concerned about that as well. I was in Warsaw recently and talked to a friend who told me that he had recently taken gun classes so that he was prepared and his skills were up to date in the event that Russia ended up coming into Poland and he had to join up with his countrymen to fight off the Russians. So certainly on the eastern flank, I don't think people are sitting in their houses and expecting Russians to storm over the border tonight. But I think they are certainly aware that it's a possibility. We just had here at my university Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who was the Belarusian opposition leader, and one of the questions she was raising in her talk was where does Putin think that Russia's borders end? In the past, the Baltic states were part of the broader Soviet Union. You had parts of Germany that had been occupied at a certain point. You had the entire eastern flank. And so I think for people in that part of the world, there is a very real question of how big Putin's aspirations actually are. Now, the reality is that Putin's forces actually are struggling in Russia. So, as aggressive and concerning as they are, most of the forces are currently occupied in Ukraine. And so, it would take quite some time to pull them out of Ukraine and mobilize them to actually go back up north to the Baltic states or to Finland. So, not impossible. Russia, of course, also still a nuclear power. But we are seeing them continue to struggle. We are seeing them have to empty out prisons to have more people to fight on the front lines. We are seeing them drag people out of the countryside with promises of money. And the fact that they are telling President Trump that as part of a settlement, they want parts of Ukraine that they have not been successful at capturing militarily to be given to them as part of a peace deal also speaks about how poorly, in a sense, they are doing on the front lines. And so, even though this war is dragging on, it really is a grinding war of attrition. We have been seeing the Ukrainians fighting quite bravely, and we have not seen the Russians take significant amounts of territory, certainly not in recent months. This broader question of Article 5 and US commitment to it is an interesting one. I mean, it's been particularly galling to see the comments that President Trump has made, both about Article 5, when, of course, the only time that it was actually invoked was when the United States invoked it after being attacked on 9/11. I had just moved to Belfast at the time and really felt the embrace of the European people in response to that event. And then, of course, you had all the really offensive comments that Trump has made about British and other soldiers that fought and died in Afghanistan, some very choice remarks about the state of the British Navy. And I think the fact that there's even questions about whether or not the US would follow the principles of Article 5 really weakens what the deterrent effect of Article 5 has been. And like I said earlier, when you take the Greenland case, the fact that you would actually have the strongest and most powerful nation threatening military action against the territory of another NATO member. And interestingly, also Canada, which, as Canadians have pointed out to me, nobody in Europe actually said anything when Trump started threatening the 51st state and military action against Canada. So it's effectively now been two NATO allies that Trump has threatened. I would like to believe deep in my heart that the United States still is going to be committed to Article 5, that there are still enough strong believers in NATO, in Congress, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the administration, that we would continue to hold faith with Article 5. But I certainly recognize and am concerned by the fact that these questions have arisen really tend to undermine the deterrent effect that Article 5 was supposed to provide.
Yeah, I think at least it seems simplistic, but I think the only symbol I can remember of the at the time of the Canadian issue was the King wearing his Canadian medals and his Canadian naval outfit as an indication, which will make the royal visit later this month quite all the more interesting. But I mean, just on that point and about the ability to defend yourself, there's a couple of questions that we can tie together about the resources and the equipment required to do that. I mean, one that asks specifically, as you touched on the French nuclear deterrent, is it time for Britain to start developing its own nuclear deterrent to sort of separate itself away from the special relationship in nuclear weapons that Trident represents? And if we did, would America care? And just on the back of that, isn't the whole process of rearmament, if you like, or accelerated defense spending in Europe likely to put a lot of places back in debt to the United States anyway, given that that's maybe where they buy a lot of the equipment from in the first place? And it's only a few years ago, I think, that we finished paying off our debts from 1945.
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear question is an interesting one, and I do not claim to have sufficient nuclear expertise to have a particularly sophisticated answer to that question. But it really is an interesting question for both Britain and France as nuclear powers, how they see themselves using that, the extent to which they would be prepared to extend their own nuclear umbrella against parts of Europe. On defense spending, that's actually been an interesting topic as well. I mean, it's not a surprise that if European governments are spending more taxpayer euros on defense, that they want to invest that money in European arms manufacturers. There's been increasing concern about the reliability of the United States. For example, there's American components in particular planes and weapon systems. The United States has very strict export laws around certain things. And similarly to the way Europeans are dependent on the United States for tech capabilities, we've seen Elon Musk shut off Starlink. It is not completely inconceivable that Trump could call up Microsoft or Google and tell them to cut off cloud services to the UK because he's unhappy about something that the British government did. There's concern about being overly reliant on on American weapon systems as well. And so there is also a desire to try and build up Europe's own defense capabilities. Now, what's interesting is the United States, perhaps not surprisingly, is unhappy about this and is unhappy about provisions within the SAFE Act that say that European money needs to be spent on European defense manufacturers and that American companies will be excluded from these procurement bids. And there was an op-ed a couple weeks ago by the ambassadors of the US to NATO and the EU threatening retaliation against Europeans if they ended up doing this. Now, this is happening at the same time that equipment that Europeans have already ordered and bought from the United States is in the factory pipeline is being taken by the Pentagon for American use in Iran. So Europe will still get its equipment. They've just been moved a bit further back in the queue in terms of when they will actually get it, which does not make the United States look like a particularly reliable defense supplier either. The other thing I would just flag on your question of capabilities, and I think there is still not a good solution for Europeans on this, that one of the big challenges that Europeans have is they don't have a lot of the critical enablers that the United States has. And what I mean by critical enablers is things like advanced intelligence and surveillance, the ability to do aerial refueling of airplanes, to do heavy strategic lift of equipment to places. This was very clear during the Libya war, where the United States was supposed to be leading from behind and yet had to provide strategic airlift and aerial refueling because European militaries simply did not have those assets available. And we are seeing that same thing play out in terms of discussions about the coalition of the willing by European nations in Ukraine. It's great that European countries are prepared to put boots on the ground, that they are organizing in a way to provide security for Ukraine. But they also realize they can't do that if they don't at least have some support from the United States. And so, for Europe really to be able to develop a much more autonomous sense of its own security capabilities, it's going to have to find a way to fill the gaps that the United States is currently providing.
Yeah, and also find a solution to the problem that's existed at least since the days of Blair and Chirac, that the two major military powers in Europe, albeit one of them no longer in the European Union, have got to agree for things to work. And that we saw that in the safe discussions as well, where Canada can join, but the United Kingdom can't.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that for me is one of the biggest problems, and I don't know quite how you get around that, which is really the fundamental lack of trust between European countries. The UK obviously has had some scratchiness with France and others as a result of Brexit. It certainly is much better than it was a couple of years ago, but the example that you give is one of those. People really rely on we talk about the French-German engine to make European politics work. That relationship has not always been as close as and effective as it has been in the past. For me, one of the things that's not discussed enough, but I'm concerned about, is one of the great intangibles that the United States has provided within Europe is a sense of leadership, that the US, in a way, has been able to play the team captain and then paper over some of these differences between European countries. The US obviously was quite supportive and involved in European reconstruction after World War II. We had the Marshall Plan, we had European support for the EU or American support. We then had very strong American support for the integration of Central and Eastern European countries into the EU and NATO. Again, we had very strong American involvement in the financial crisis in 2015, which was quite ironic because you have the euro being set up as a currency in part to provide a counterweight to the dollar, and yet we had the US very actively involved with international financial institutions to try and keep the single currency afloat. And so what's ironic now is it is unclear to me who actually in Europe is going to provide some of this leadership and convening power, and how are you going to get over these problems of the lack of trust between European countries. So in a sense, at a moment, you really need the United States to help Europe figure out how to separate itself from the United States, which is this difficult situation that Europe finds itself in. And I really don't know how Europe gets over this sense of mistrust. I mean, if you don't trust that the Belgian medical kit is going to be sufficiently up to standard in Germany, I don't know how you're actually going to do that on bigger and much more consequential things.
Absolutely. I've got one question for your crystal ball, which I shall leave to the end. But in before we get to that one, little question on United Kingdom and Scotland, which you know well. I mean, should probably be an impossible question to ask, but do you think any of what we've just been talking about for the last 50 minutes would be different if the United Kingdom hadn't left the European Union in 2016? or indeed, and you did this, I understand, is getting into a really interesting area. Do you think any of that would be different if Scotland had left the United Kingdom in 2014?
I mean, on these macro questions, I don't think so. I mean, the UK and the EU is not going to change the fact that Trump sees the EU as an economic foe. It's not going to change the fact that he sees uh, NATO as a bunch of free riders. One thing that I found interesting last year in participating in think tank events and talking to Brits was that a lot of Brits wanted to believe that there was still a special relationship with the United States, and that even though Trump was saying some of these mean things about the rest of Europe, surely he was not going to do that to Britain. And the economic relationship was going to be better. The defense relationship was going to be better. The relationship with the prime minister was going to be better. And frankly, especially when you see a lot of the rhetoric that Trump has dumped on Starmer over the last couple of weeks, I'm not actually sure that even in Trump's mind, the UK, independent of the EU or not, is necessarily being granted any special favor different from what France and Germany is.
And I suspect it feels like that way where my photograph is, which is probably 10 miles away from where Mary McLeod Trump was born. So I suspect it's not that different. Crystal ball time. Inevitably, we're going looking forward to the midterms in the United States and on them. Never mind what might happen in France or in Hungary or wherever else in the meantime. But casting ahead to 2028, are we right to assume that this doesn't suddenly switch back or change back just because the incumbent of the White House changes in 2028? And I take it as a positive that the president has unveiled his plans for his presidential library in Florida, because that suggests that he might actually can be considering to leave at some point. But is a post-Trump Republican White House, say if it's a Republican White House, really going to be very different from the one we've got now?
I mean, let me say a couple of things on that. I mean, first, you mentioned the situation in Europe, and I think there really are real risks facing Europe closer to home. I think the French elections next year are a very serious concern. The rising support for the AfD in Germany is a concern. We've already seen problems with some of these illiberal governments in Eastern Europe and places like Hungary. But I think we're going to have pretty significant problems if some of these big countries in Western Europe end up flipping to the other side. And there is a certain irony in what Trump is supporting, which is calling on countries to heavily arm themselves. At the same time, he is calling for rising support of far-right parties, which frankly is a combination that did not work particularly well in Europe's past. On the question of elections, we can start with the midterms this fall. I think Europeans have wanted to put a lot of hope in midterms. I think Americans have wanted to put a lot of hope in midterms. I remind people the midterms are still 6 months away. So lots can happen before we get to the midterms. And even after the midterm elections, Trump still has 2 more years in power. If you look at polling, the Democrats have been doing incredibly well in special elections that have been held for seats that are being vacated by members of Congress for various reasons, in governor elections that have been happening. So certainly the polling, if the elections were now, suggests that the Democrats would do very, very well. I think it is extremely likely that the Democrats will take the House. The Republicans have a very, very slim majority. All of those seats are up for election, and it doesn't actually take that much for the Democrats to flip the House. The Senate is much more difficult. You, of course, only have a third of the Senate seats that are going to be up for election this November, and there the math is harder for the Democrats to win. So if the Democrats take the House, I think it will be helpful. It will make the Democrats feel like they've got a foot in the game. It'll give them a little bit more power than what they have now. people often ask me why the Democrats in Congress aren't doing things. Structurally, the way our system is set up, if you are in the minority in Congress, you frankly don't have a lot of power. And we've even seen hearings that the Republicans have been holding with members of the Trump administration, where frankly, these cabinet members have been extremely disrespectful and provocative in these hearings. So what I think if the Democrats win the House is you will see more oversight, you will see more investigations in the administration, you'll see more oversight hearings. I think there will be incredible pressure for the House to bring articles of impeachment against Trump, which, I can remind you happened twice in Trump's first term. And then those articles of impeachment get sent to the Senate, and you need to have 2/3 of senators present and voting for that actually to take effect. So even if the Democrats win the Senate by a small majority, it is very unlikely, unless something dramatic changes, that you're going to have a large number of Republicans who are supporting that as well. So then we get to your question of what happens in the presidential elections. And, I get asked questions a lot about who the candidates are going to be. The one reminder that I would have is the US is not a parliamentary system. It works differently from the way your system works in Britain, where you have a very clear leader of the opposition party. And so there is a single figurehead who is the leader of the opposition. That is not the way that the system works in the US. The Democrats are in the opposition, but it is a much more fragmented system. And so historically, it has not been clear who the candidate is going to be until we get past the midterms. So I think it's going to be the end of this year, the beginning of next year, before that campaign really starts to heat up. On the Republican side, there continues to be lots of debate about who Trump is likely to anoint as his successor. Vance and Rubio both are the front runners for that contest. Vance, of course, much more ideologically supportive of MAGA. Rubio, of course, has run for president before and ran against Trump in the primaries in 2016, and so really not a MAGA hardliner. They seem most likely to be the front runner candidates on the Republican side. And then on the Democratic side, we'll see. I think there's a lot of commentary out there suggesting what we really need is a straight white male candidate to run. There's a number of governors that coincidentally have personal books and autobiographies that have been published in the last couple of weeks and months. There was a very large number of Americans at the Munich Security Conference in February. We had a large number of governors, we had senators, we had House members. So I think it's really going to be a wide open campaign on the Democratic side. And if you remember, even back to Obama before 2008, it is possible that somebody emerges as the front runner on the Democratic side that nobody is even really thinking about right now. We saw a lot of excitement around James Tallarico, who's running for Senate in Texas, coming out of the seminary, the ability to engage in a much more religious way, reminiscent of a lot of the hope and change language that Obama used that people got quite excited about. The last part of your question on what this means going forward, I really don't think that there is going to be a return to normal. When I worked for Biden in his administration, he spoke at the Munich Security Conference in February 2021, and his message was America is back. And as he said, even in his speech, European leaders like Macron said to him, but for how long? And so I think there is not going to be the same Biden-esque build back better. I think we are going to have to build something new. And so there's a lot of thinking already happening in Washington and other places about what that looks like. I mentioned on defense, we are not going to be able to go back to a place where a future American president says, don't worry about it, Europe. You don't have to spend so much money on defense. We've got you. That's gone. There's going to be real debates about development, for example. I think the idea that the U.S. stands back up USAID and invests billions of dollars like it was before on development is probably also not going to happen. And so there's going to have to be discussions about what areas of policy and development does a new administration want to work on? And then, if you go back to the place where we started, there's a tremendous amount of damage that's been done. You've got the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, for example, talking about the need for middle powers to be much more engaged. We have China taking advantage of a lot of the gaps that the United States is leaving. So a new president is not going to come into a world that looks like the world that Trump entered in 2024. And so I think there's going to have to be a lot of careful thinking about what this looks like. And potentially you have a much more militarily capable and assertive Europe as well. So I think there's a tremendous amount of unknowns, but I think we are not going to be in a place where we are going to go back to what there was before. We're going to have to build something new.
I'm sure that's right. And as you mentioned, the clock is ticking over. But as you mentioned, Mark Carney in the middle powers, you could give a one-word answer to this if you like. Is that somewhere Britain should be? Should we be speaking to Canada and Australia and others to be part of a sort of a new loose alliance there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all major democracies in the world should be trying to find ways to work together. I mean, you've seen the EU trying to expedite trade deals with India, with Mercosur, with conversations with Europe. I think you need to have countries that are going to uphold standards of rule of law, of international law. I think there's real questions about who is providing for refugees, who is going to be dealing with humanitarian situations. And so I think middle powers really have no choice but to be finding new and creative ways to work together and to strengthen their own alliances.
That's great. I'm very conscious that you have a life in Spain to go and lead, so I don't want to keep you any longer. So what I will do first is to remind people that if they want to hear more, your podcast with Natalie Tocci, Power and Purpose, is out there on all good wherever you get your podcasts, as they say, and strongly recommended. But I think, as we expected, you've managed to bring an enormous amount of different perspectives together from your background, both in the White House and in places like Brookings, but also your knowledge of Scotland, the UK, and wider Europe. And for that, we're extremely grateful. So it just remains to me, on behalf of all the people whose faces we cannot see, to say, Amanda, wonderful to see you again, and thank you very much.
I will thank you, John, for all of the really insightful and thoughtful questions. And I should say, people ask me all the time of the places that I've lived and traveled, where is my favorite? And I always tell them Edinburgh. There's always a very special place in my heart that's there, and it's really the place that turned me from a pretty clueless American about what was happening in the world and foreign policy to somebody who had some semblance of what was happening in Europe. So really appreciate the invitation from the European movement to do this event, and can't think of a better person to discuss all of these issues with than you. So thanks very much to you as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Great to see you. See you somewhere, sometime.
Yes, thank
Thanks
you.
again. Bye.